A few months back, if you had told me that I would make a video about a baseball-themed poem, I would have thought you were crazy. It's quite remarkable, the things that you can find by accident. Every time I read baseball's sad lexicon, I was left with more questions. Questions I simply had to have the answers to. What I thought was merely a pithy bit of rhyming about three strangers was, in actuality, a verbal monument to three legends who changed the face of baseball forever. July 12th, 1910, New York, New York. Franklin Pierce Adams, a writer for the New York Evening Mail, needed just 8 lines to fill his column, all in good humor. The day before, his hometown team, the Chicago Cubs, had played against their storied rivals, the New York Giants. Having fallen behind, the Giants began to make a comeback in the 8th inning. This, however, was cut short by the 3 players whose very names struck fear in the hearts of any batter who didn't clear the infield: Tinker, Evers, and Chance. After reflecting on the game the day before and the 3 players who delivered the killing blow, Adams had all he needed to pen what would become a part of baseball lore. Originally titled That Double Play Again, it was later changed to Baseball's Sad Lexicon and reads thusly. These are the saddest of possible words, Tinker to Evers to Chance. A trio of bear cubs and fleeter than birds, Tinker and Evers and Chance. Ruthlessly pricking our gonfalon bubble, making a giant hit into a double, words that are heavy with nothing but trouble, Tinker to Evers to Chance. F.P. Adams had no way of knowing that his 8 humble lines would ignite the imaginations of wordsmiths across the country. In no time at all, poems utilizing the same cadence cropped up everywhere. The poem was reprinted in multiple papers, and people began sending their own poems to Adams, who would put them in his column. In response to the unprecedented success and popularity of the poem, Theophilus Niles, the editor for the New York Evening Mail, said, "Frank may write a better piece of verse, but this is the one he'll be remembered for." After reading Baseball's Sad Lexicon, I was blown away with the beautiful rhythm of the poem. Who knew a poem about 3 baseball players could sound so beautiful? It was at this point that I realized that I was enjoying something that I only partially comprehended. Contemporaries of Adams were at an advantage because the names Tinker, Evers, and Chance would have struck an immediate chord with them. When I finished reading the poem, my question was, who in the world were Tinker, Evers, and Chance? Frank Chance was born on September 9th, 1876, in Fresno, California. His parents were among the first groups of pioneers who had traveled across the country on the Oregon Trail. Both his father and mother had made the journey as children. Baseball had migrated with the travelers who had come from the Midwest, which gave them a much-needed outlet. Frank Chance played baseball from a young age. During one game in 1894, Chance was hit in the head by a pitch that had been momentarily masked by a cloud of dust. Though seemingly knocked out, Chance would eventually recover. Little did he know that his ability to endure physical punishment would become a hallmark of the rest of his baseball career. While Frank Chance showed promise as a ballplayer, he also excelled at boxing. Prize fighting at this point in time was largely illegal and socially frowned upon. Despite the negative public perception, Chance boxed at a local Fresno athletic club and gained some notoriety, even getting an opportunity to play Chrysanthemum Joe Koinski in a 3-round charity sparring match. In one instance, he broke a bone in his hand at his boxing club, but decided to play baseball the following day so as to not let down his team. It was during this time that Chance earned his lifelong nickname, Husk, for he was as tough as a corn husk. Despite getting an offer to play for the then-named Chicago Colts, Frank Chance stuck with his team, the Fresno Republicans, through the remainder of their season, which turned out to be one of, if not their best season. Frank Chance was a leader, and the move from player to team captain was an easy one. He had led his team to an 11-0 victory in an amateur tournament. Frank Chance made a name for himself as being able to instill confidence in his players and being unfazed in the face of adversity. These traits also would serve him well for the rest of his baseball career. During an exhibition, Chance got to play alongside and against several National League players. It was during this exhibition that one May Selee, the then future manager of the Chicago Cubs, would take notice of this large boxer from Fresno. The offer to play ball in Chicago was given again, and this time, Chance took the opportunity. In 1898, Frank Chance signed on to be part of the Chicago team that James Hart was building. Little did he know that his calming presence and inspiring demeanor would be fundamental to the future Chicago Cubs. Like his parents, he was setting off on a great journey across the country with no promise of success. Joe Tinker was born on July 27, 1880, in Muskota, Kansas. Joe's arrival into the world brought with it heavy social consequences. His mother, Elizabeth Williams, gave birth to Joe and his twin sister out of wedlock. Sadly, Joe's sister did not survive very long. The unknown father, thought to have been a migrant railroad worker, vanished from the picture. This left Elizabeth a single mother in a then unsympathetic small town. She soon relocated to Kansas City, Missouri, where she built a life with her new partner, William Tinker. Luckily for Joe, not long before his arrival in Kansas City, the area had hit a crucial stretch of development. In 1880, the same year of Tinker's birth, almost none of the roads in Kansas City had been paved. Things changed for Kansas City in 1892, when architect George Kessler was brought on to design a layout of the city that would include new parks and roadways. This meant that by the time Joe was old enough to run around and play, there were many places he could go to develop his love of baseball. Many years later, whilst playing for the Portland Webfooters, a minor league team, Tinker was offered to try out for John Brush's Cincinnati Red Stockings. There was a problem, though. John Brush wasn't planning on paying the Webfooters anything for stealing away their prized third baseman. Brush, who was acting against the newly written rules laid out by the National Association of Professional Baseball, assumed that any bright, hungry ball player would jump at the chance to ascend from the minors into the majors. In essence, he knew how fast Joe could throw a ball, but he didn't truly know Joe Tinker. Brush wanted Joe to leave the Webfooters, thereby breaking his contract, and to try out for the Red Stockings. Joe knew that this was a bad idea. Not only was it morally wrong, but if he failed to make the team, surely the Webfooters and any other self-respecting minor league team would have nothing to do with him. Though a heated back and forth ensued, Brush refused to bend to Tinker's wish that his team be guaranteed his release fee if he made the team. Eventually, word of Tinker and his war with Brush reached James Hart, who was in the midst of rebuilding his Chicago team that would go on to become known as the Cubs. He accepted Tinker's reasonable request, and with that, Joe Tinker set off to Chicago to impress Hart's ball team manager, Frank Selee. After a shaky start, Tinker made the cut, which meant that his former team, the Webfooters, got paid for the remainder of the season that Tinker wouldn't be playing. Selee, a baseball talent savant, said of Tinker, "The boy has enthusiasm and ginger, and is the most natural ball player I have seen in many a day." Johnny Evers was born June 21st, 1881, in Troy, New York. Not only did Johnny's father play baseball, but the city of Troy was the hometown of many talented major leaguers, the most notable of whom was King Kelly, whose exploits on the ball field are so outrageous that they blur the lines between fact and fiction. Expectations are a tricky thing. They can be placed on a person by others, or possibly more dangerously, by themselves. Johnny's father was well known and well liked in the city of Troy. He even went on to hold a position on the school board, and even as an assistant clerk of the Board of Water Commission, which brought with it financial security and no small degree of influence. In many respects, the life story of John J. Evers Sr. seemed a classic immigrant saga of achievement, acceptance, and assimilation, except that in South Troy, as in other Irish strongholds across the United States, there remained a powerful sense of ethnic identity and cultural pride. After going from the Cheer-Ups, an amateur club, to a minor league team called the Troy Trojans, Johnny made a name for himself as not only a competent infielder, but also as an impressive batter. John Sr., who had severe health problems, would try to get out to the ballpark to see his son play as much as he could from a hill nearby. One day, Johnny's father told him that he would no longer go to the games. As it turned out, John Sr. had been sitting next to a heckler who was verbally berating his son. After the realization that he didn't have the strength to respond to the treatment of his son, he decided he could no longer go to the games. John Sr. passed away not long after that, at only 54 years old. Often I looked for the fan who had knocked me and spoiled my father's little pleasure and sunshine, but failed to find him. Fate would change for Evers when his team manager, Lou Bacon, put in a good word with one Frank Selee, who was in dire need of a shortstop whilst rebuilding Chicago's National League team. Directionless after the loss of his beloved father, Johnny initially showed no interest in going to play for some upstart Chicago ball club. But after discussing it with his family, he decided to take the leap. After arriving in Philadelphia to play his inaugural game, Evers would suffer the hazing that many of the other players had suffered. After being given a uniform that was way too big, Evers was forced to ride from the team's hotel to the ballpark on top of a horse-driven omnibus. His teammates told him that there was no room for him. Inside the omnibus was the former rookie, Joe Tinker, who was now on the giving end of the hazing. Keep this event in mind for later. Despite an overall poor performance by Evers, Selee, who knew talent when he saw it, decided that Evers was something special. Prior to Tinker, Evers, and Chance's arrival, the Chicago National League team had struggled with its identity. The team itself had undergone many official and unofficial name changes. They'd been called the White Stockings, then they were called the Colts, Then, after their old manager left and before Frank Selee became their manager, they were dubbed the Orphans. In 1901, Frank and May Selee took charge of the Chicago team, overhauling not only their roster, but also their public affairs. Frank Selee, over the course of the emergence of this new and improved Chicago team, would move Tinker, Evers, and Chance into different field positions from where they started. In 1902, Selee moved Frank Chance from catcher to first base. In the same year, Selee moved Joe Tinker from his third base position to shortstop. In 1903, after a solid backup performance, Selee moved Johnny Evers from a backup infielder to second base. With that final position switch, Frank Selee had forged an ironclad infield that would prove lethal in the years to come. If it hadn't been for Selee, the poem Baseball's Sad Lexicon wouldn't exist. Baseball players don't lose their personality when they put on a uniform, grab a bat, and step out onto the diamond. Both Joe Tinker and Johnny Evers were not nearly as unshakable as their player-manager, Frank Chance, who took over from Frank Selee after his health began failing. Both players were young and eager to prove themselves. In 1905, their interpersonal frustrations came to a head when the team was playing in Bedford, Indiana. Both Tinker and Evers were to be taken by carriage from the hotel to the ball field. Evers got ready first and rushed out of the hotel and took the last remaining carriage for himself, leaving the furious Joe Tinker to walk. This event bears some similarities to the hazing event that ended with Evers having to ride on top of an omnibus, while Tinker laughed at his expense. After Tinker arrived at the ball field, he intentionally hit Evers with a ball during warm-ups. A fight ensued that eventually involved many spectators. It took some time before things calmed down. It was this incident that resulted in Tinker and Evers agreeing not to speak to one another unless absolutely necessary. Because of the bad blood that lay between the two, a strange sort of mutually beneficial competitiveness evolved. Even though they disliked each other, they were an incredible team. You simply did not let the other fellow beat you, and you either got the ball he threw to you, or were knocked down by it. Umpires have always had a difficult job. No matter their decision, they're bound to instantaneously find themselves in a ball field half full of people who dislike them. One umpire who had a rough few games was Henry O'Day, who found himself as the one and only umpire at a heated 1908 game between the Chicago Cubs and the Pittsburgh Pirates, both of whom were tied with the New York Giants for the pennant. It was the bottom of the 10th, and both teams were sitting on zero. The Pirates had a few lucky breaks, and the bases were full, with 2 outs. Whatever happened next would determine the game. A rookie by the name of John Owen Wilson smacked the pitch out into center field. The runner on third base, Fred Clark, reached home plate. The runner on second, the renowned Honus Wagner, and the runner on first, Warren Gill, started walking toward the dugout to receive praise from their adoring fans, who began rushing the field after the batter, John Owen Wilson, touched first base. There was just one problem, though. Johnny, the human crab, Evers. He saw that Gill had given up his run between first and second, and shouted for his teammates to throw him the ball. Amidst the chaos, the lone umpire, Henry O'Day, didn't see what was happening. Evers got the ball and touched second base. As it turned out, there was an oft-overlooked rule at that time that stated that a run was invalid if there were 2 outs and one of the runners advancing the other runners was either tagged or forced out at a base. Since Gill didn't touch the base, Evers argued that he was forced out, and the run did not count. It was too late. O'Day, who already had a reputation for not tolerating players who argued with him, was having none of Evers' ravings. The run was not erased, and Evers was determined to take this issue to the top. The next day, C.W. Murphy, the club owner, took his team's case before Harry Pulliam, who was the National League president. Pulliam sided with O'Day's call and claimed that since there was no witnessed force out, the Pirates were in the clear. However, in so doing, he reaffirmed that a forced third out would nullify the run preceding it. This decision set a precedent that laid the groundwork for one of the most insane events in baseball history just 19 days later. September 23rd, Polo Grounds, Manhattan, New York. The Chicago Cubs were playing their bitter rivals, the New York Giants. It was the bottom of the ninth, and the Cubs and the Giants were deadlocked at 1-1. The Giants were at bat, and they had 2 outs. Moose McCormick, poised to deliver the coup de grace, was on third base, and rookie Fred Merkle was at first. Finally, Al Bridwell, for the Giants, stepped up to the plate. He swung hard at the pitch and nailed the ball so hard it nearly hit an umpire who was thrown off balance. As soon as Bridwell made contact, McCormick sprinted for home plate and touched it, seemingly winning it all for the Giants, canceling the Cubs' hope of a playoff game. There was just one problem, though. Johnny, the human crab, Evers. As soon as McCormick crossed home plate, Fred Merkle, who was only halfway between first and second base, simply ran off in the direction of the adoring New York fans. The New York faithful, who believed that they had won the game, started a general pandemonium. This time, Tinker, Evers, and Chance were going to change the fate of the Cubs. Evers rushed to second and called for the ball. The center fielder threw it high over Evers' head. It ended up hitting Joe Tinker and falling to the ground. Amidst the celebrating, one of the Giants players, Joe McGinnity, realized what was happening and rushed onto the field to try and snatch up the ball. By this point, fielding the ball was difficult because there were fans on the diamond. McGinnity tried to throw the ball away, but had his arms pinned down by Cubs players. The ball landed near the pitcher's bullpen. This complicated matters even further because there were other balls nearby for practice. Someone had hold of a ball near where McGinnity had tried to dispose of it. A couple of Cubs players wrestled it away from whoever had hold of it. The ball was thrown to the awaiting Evers, who was still solidly planted on second base. Any efforts to show what had happened to umpire Bob Elmsley, who'd nearly toppled over after almost being hit with the drive from Bridwell, were useless. That didn't matter, though, because there was another umpire working the game, Hank O'Day, and this time, he saw everything. The New York players and fans knew that something was going horribly wrong. Why wasn't the game over? Frank Chance was demanding that the game go into extra innings because the score was still tied 1-1. There was no use. The instant that the fans on the diamond suspected that their win was to be undone, they began attacking the umpires. Police had to escort Elmsley, O'Day, and the Cubs team off the field for their own safety. By that point, there was no clearing the field, and the light had faded, which meant that if the scores remained tied, the game would have to be replayed. Following the game, eyewitness testimony from the umpires and various players was collected and compared. Pulliam, who had previously always sided with the testimony of his umpires, and had confirmed Evers' assertion about a forced play as a third out, had no choice but to make the teams play the game over again if they were both eligible at the end of the season. Sure enough, the playoff game was to be a rematch between the Cubs and the Giants. After a spectacular performance by one of the Cubs' pitchers, the deadly Mordecai Three-Finger Brown, who had overcome a horrible injury that mangled his right hand, the Cubs clinched the win with a score of 4-1. The Cubs had won the pennant. After their player years were over, Tinker, Evers, and Chance would go on to various coaching positions, business ventures, and sadly, health problems. Tinker, Evers, and Chance would be inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1946. At the height of the Cubs dynasty, they won 116 out of 154 games. They also won the World Series in 1907 and 1908. The Chicago Cubs helped save baseball from being relegated to a morally bankrupt pastime like going to a horse race or a boxing match, both of which were seen in a negative light. They were brought together by Selee, who was calm and analytical, and held together by Frank Chance, who truly was unshakable. He led the Cubs by example. Even with their rivalry, Tinker and Evers were baseball players of the finest order. They knew what to do and how to do it. Bullying and intimidation were replaced with skill and a knowledge of the game. When the Chicago Cubs won the World Series in 2016, I didn't understand what all the fuss was about. The stories the die-hard fans were holding on to. Now I think I understand just a little bit more about why that win meant so much. Not everyone deserves to have a poem written about them. F.P. Adams used only 8 lines to create a phenomenal poem that carried so much historical weight. Now that I've studied the lives of Tinker, Evers, and Chance, the true meaning of the poem shines through all the more. I love stories, and often I find that stories lead to other stories. I don't watch baseball. I've only ever been to a handful of ball games over the course of my life. But that doesn't matter. Making this video, I got to learn about 3 legendary baseball players whose skill and precision changed the face of the game. Each of them came from such different backgrounds, but each of them had pain and trials to overcome. When I sit in the stands, I'm not seeing all that those players have gone through to get there. After learning about Tinker, Evers, and Chance, I don't think I'll ever watch a ball game the same way again. Who knows? Maybe someday, you or I will be at a baseball game worth writing a poem about. Thanks so much for watching. I'll catch you guys in the next one.